I'm here recording this lecture on modern art. I've learned that in the world of video, there's maybe one or two times a week when there's some technical problems. And so this is my third attempt at this. And one time I got all the way through it and it crashed in the last minute. So I'm going to try to keep this rather short and sweet. One of the reasons I can do that is because I've put up in Google Classroom underneath this section on modern art a whole bunch of short 4 to 7 minute videos that explore some of this artwork in a deeper way. So what this is meant to do is to be an introductory lecture for you to understand from the European perspective of history how this fits, and then I'd like you to get into some of the artists I put in your work for the week that I'd like you to choose at least 4 of them. It'd be better if you watch more. These could be a part of reference making, outside information, or I suppose even the topic to an extent of your DBQ. I don't think that it will be the main focus, but nonetheless, it's important to learn about the art of this period and what it responded to. Now, you should have by now watched the lecture on modern thought, and you can see a lot of unrest there and a lot of new ideas and a lot of instability and a lot of contradictory thought, and that certainly shows up in the art of this period. But we're going to start back a little bit earlier with modern art. And so when I say modern art, there's a lot of different definitions of this. You might think of modern art as just purely the art that you might see in a museum that's very splashes of color, paint splatters on a canvas, or maybe even something akin to performance art, which I would put more in the category of more of the postmodern. But when we think about modern art, I want you to think about it as the time when art begins to truly move away from purely representing objects in a distinct way. So let me explain what I mean by that so we can kind of get our heads wrapped around this idea of where we're starting the modern art terminology for our purposes. So I want you to think about that there's always been discussions of art all year long about how artwork is presented. So in the Renaissance, we were looking at an idealized version of man, an idealized version of the body. In Baroque art, we were looking for artwork that would be lit up in a spiritual perspective that the Catholic Church could use to call people back to its theology. And so that artwork served a specific purpose, but it also had a specific style with a lot of direct looks from the canvas. If you remember when we looked at Daniel in the Lion's Den, that Baroque piece by Peter Paul Rubens, and how it's used, the light and the way that the figures are cast in the foreground is used to draw us in emotionally to the painting. And we've had looks at artwork that was meant to represent more bucolic scenes, more realism. We've had artwork that was very political, like Jacques-Louis David's artwork, but all of this artwork did concentrate on some type of specific representation, whether an idealized representation or whether a spiritualized representation of the work itself. If you're painting a work called Daniel in the Lion's Den, okay, up to this point, it's going to look like Daniel in the Lion's Den. Whether that piece is a Renaissance piece or a Baroque piece, you're going to know what the subject is clearly, and you're going to probably be able to identify the people in the artwork. Now, with the beginnings of Impressionism, we turn a little bit less toward the artist being concerned about how he's representing the piece on the canvas, and a little bit more concerned about how he or she is representing self. And that's a good place to start Impressionism, because with Impressionism, we're being asked to consider the artist's take, the artist's impression of an object. Certainly something is still being painted here, and we're going to look at a few pieces on the next screen. But when you're talking about Impressionism, you're entering a period where the artist is trying to represent something certainly differently than they have in the past. So let's get going, all right? So under Impressionism, who were the Impressionist artists, first of all? Well, this covered a pretty wide range of artists. Manet, Monet is probably the most famous of the Impressionist artists, Renoir. Here you have Monet and Edgar Degas and Mary Cassatt. The thing about the Impressionists is that they want to paint the impression that light gives. And so they're very interested in filtering light through different places on the canvas, whether that be through clothing, through clouds, through nature, or even the way that it is displayed on a face. So let's talk about some Impressionist works for just a minute. You're probably most familiar with Impressionist art out of all of the art that we'll look at today. It's some of the most accessible. People like the pretty colors. They like the lightness. It's pleasing to most people. But when Impressionism first appeared on the scene in Europe, it was not well received, because you have to remember that until this point, the art had been largely representational. And now people are saying, well, this doesn't even look like Woman with a Parasol. Let's talk about this piece by Monet first, right? Woman with a Parasol right here. Monet was interested in, again, showing this light and showing the reflections of natural light on the canvas. So you can see that he chose to represent this woman in this specific dress, in this specific field, with this specific sky and this specific parasol, so that he could show light filtering in various ways. Her face is somewhat obscured because we're much more concerned about the impression of a woman with a parasol than we are with, with this particular woman with a parasol. And so Monet's work came to dominate a lot of impressionistic exhibitions. But at first, these things were rejected from the fine arts world that was mainstreamed, even in Paris. And so these painters were considered a little bit more avant-garde, a little bit more risky, and some were considered to not have very much talent when they first appeared on the scene. Saying a word about Monet. When you're looking at Monet's work, you're probably familiar with his pieces on the cathedral at Rouen, or his work called Haystacks, where he or Water Lilies, where he shows his topic, all those three topics by name, obviously. He shows his topic at various positions of the day, various positions of the sun, and how the sun is casting light on the work that he's interested in doing. And so for Monet, that importance of the painting, of the light and the reflection, I wouldn't say that it totally obscures his subject, but it's certainly what he's interested in. So you'll see that he does these studies of these things. Edgar Degas, famous for painting. He also did sculpture, but his work with painting dancers is certainly probably his most remarkable work. And you can see these ballet dancers here with the light filtering through their skirts, right? You tend to look at the tulle of these ballet skirts before you look at the faces or even the poses of the dancers. And you're looking at the skirt first, and then probably the legs as they meet the foreground of the painting. And that's because of the light and the way Degas is using it, even as that one dancer's arm is extended right here up into the painting. We see that light is what's being used in a special way to draw us into this particular work. And then Mary Cassatt, her painting is down here, and she's also an Impressionist. Her work is a little bit different than the work of some of the other Impressionists. I know that you guys are just, I think, 1 year too old to have been involved in our elementary art program that's called Meet the Masters. And what's kind of neat is that our students in the grammar school, I think starting with the 10th graders, the class just below you, they had it in 6th grade, where they would study 7 artists a year, and there's a 5-year track. And so if you started in kindergarten, you will complete that track before you get out of grammar school and even have time to repeat one. And you will learn about the work and the history and the purpose of many people in the artist pantheon, if you will. And Mary Cassatt is one of the artists that they learn about in the first year. And one of the things that they do as young people is to study the artist, but then try some of the things that they did. And so when they learn about Mary Cassatt, one of the things that they do, interestingly enough, is they learn to draw a face, and they also learn how to cast shadow on a face by placing a head covering on. It's kind of interesting that in Cassatt's work here, you have head coverings on all 3 people in the boat, and it gives her a chance to show what light on a face looks like, whether that person is facing whether or not the light source is coming from the outside of the painting and hitting this child halfway through their face, whether it's obscured on the face because of this woman's head covering, but certainly present on her body, or whether the person in the foreground of the painting is obscured from light completely. And these light colors of the boat that focus our attention and cause us to look inside of the boat rather than outside at the sea or the background surrounding. It shows an interesting technique. And so Impressionism, while at first not well received, certainly eventually held its own in the art world. Now we're going to move on to what we might call post-impressionism, or some people might call it expressionism. You might see it called both. If you're talking about abstract expressionism, you're talking about something that's a far less representational than in what you're looking at here. You can probably see the departure in each slide, a further departure from what we might call realism, all right? And so if you looked at the last piece, those objects that you looked at in the last piece on the last slide were certainly recognizable as a woman carrying a parasol, some people in a boat, sorry guys, as dancers. Okay, we see all that. But here we start to see a movement away from that. Now, it's not abstract expressionism where you have paint splattering and things like that, but we do see an expression of, like, for instance, Van Gogh's Starry Night rather than a starry night itself. If I asked you to go out and successfully paint the starry night sky, it probably would not look like this if you were attempting to truly represent it. But this is Van Gogh's impression, okay, or what he feels he can express about the night sky. Some of Van Gogh's work was not given the long study that some previous artists had put to the work. It was more painted in the emotion and exuberance of taking in a night sky and then painting what is brought out in the artist from this experience. Up at the top here, you have Georges Seurat's Sunday on the island of La Grande Jatte, and you can't see it real well in the picture that I've chosen here, but his work you might be familiar with. It's called pointillism, and pointillism is where there are these dots on the canvas that accomplish the work. So unlike the brush strokes of Impressionism, or even more wild brush strokes of Van Gogh, and a lot of paint left on the canvas. In pointillism, you have a much more exact, and yet still paint is deposited to create this overall picture. Now, we would not say that the pictures in this picture of a Sunday afternoon look realistic. Okay, in fact, a lot of them are very exaggerated in their body shape and style, but they're there to create an impression, okay, or the expression perhaps is better, of what this peaceful Sunday afternoon might look like. And over here, you have something that's perhaps the most radical of the three, Gustav Klimt's The Kiss. This is, of course, figures that we can certainly recognize as human, but they are not drawn in a way that you say, wow, they really represented what humans look like exactly. That's not true in the formation of their figures. Clearly, with the way that the clothing is wrapped around these figures, that's not the goal. We would not say that this position of the two humans and the way that they are embracing is realistic or necessarily natural, but it certainly is intriguing, and it draws in the viewer with the idea of the artist's expression of what he finds to be this romantic embrace between the two figures in the picture and what is enveloped in what he calls the kiss. And so in post-impressionism or expressionism, we have again a further regard for the artist and their feelings and ideas about what's being represented. And we're going to go even further. Let's move on and talk a little bit about Cubism. So this is Pablo Picasso. Cubism is an emphasis on shape in art. On varying shapes, and you can see all kinds of contrasting shapes in this painting that some would have found disturbing or disorienting. But the Cubist movement was a movement that changed a lot of art forever. And I think the video that I put up on Cubism talks about it being the most groundbreaking in the sense that it truly breaks off the idea that the artwork is representing something that we can immediately ascertain and say, okay, see, in our last two slides, we could say, well, there's a woman with a parasol, or there are dancers, or okay, there is a starry night. When we look at these works, we're not perhaps exactly sure what's going on. We may get a thought for some of these things. The titles may help us or they may not. And Picasso's work in Cubism and the emphasis on shape pulls us away from that instantly recognizable subject and more into the world of the artist himself. So when we get into even further works, then we're going to be talking about abstraction. All right, and so we move into the abstract. Now, in the last slide, when you were looking at Picasso's piece called Guernica, that example of his work, you might not have been able to tell what that work was about, but you might have been able to pick up on the fact that it was pretty chaotic. It was pretty, it looked like a piece of work where it was not casting a general mood of happiness. And that piece of work is probably one of Picasso's most famous. We'll talk a little bit more about it when we get into the dictatorships and world war section of next week. It was painted about the Spanish Civil War and was painted in 1937. But when we think about that work, we can at least tell what's going on. We can tell that there's something bad happening and that he's representing some chaotic feelings. What kind of feelings is this work representing? Well, this work is by a Russian artist named Kandinsky, and he's considered the father of abstract art. And when we think about abstract art, this is where some of us might think, well, this is what modern art feels like to me. You might be tempted to say, along with what other people have said, well, anyone can do this. Anyone can do this. This particular piece is called Square with Concentric Circles. And Kandinsky is expressing his particular feelings and his particular emotions and his particular engagement with color and with shape in this abstract art. It's kind of interesting. When you look at modern art, the further art gets away from representation, probably the more skeptical I personally have become. And I think there are limits to what art, when it becomes no longer art. But I think we can have appreciation for the prettiness, the beauty, if not the messaging of this particular art, although some of us might be able to relate more. I'll tell you that when I look at abstract art, or even on the next slide, surrealist art, I did have experience that I considered to be kind of interesting and important when I visited the Dali Museum. I had never gone, and I believe that you guys have been, and that you go with Spanish class. I don't know for sure if you've already done that. I think you did that this year even. But let's move on and talk about surrealism, because out of the movement toward more abstract art also came new art forms. We're going to talk about one more first before we get to surrealism, and that's Dadaism. You know, some people would draw the line with Dadaism. You probably have heard of it before. This particular piece of artwork says, this is not a pipe, right? What is Dadaism? Well, it's playing with contradiction. It's playing with irony. It's playing with statements that are wild, mad, shocking, silly. You will see that I've put a particular video on Dadaism up under Google Classroom, and it shows you some of the exhibition works in Dadaism. Your text shows some of these as well. It's the silliness, the hobby horse art of Dadaism that some people saw it as this groundbreaking movement, and some people saw it as mockery. It's hard to know the difference when you're looking at Dadaism. When you're looking at this particular piece, is this supposed to be messing with your mind, or is this supposed to be a representation of contradiction? Again, we're in that post-World War I world where more and more goes because there's more and more confusion and more disorientation. And so Dadaism had things in it from "This is not a pipe" to paintings of the Mona Lisa with a mustache painted on it, to people dressing up in paper cones. And so Dadaism was certainly in your face, breaking away from the traditional rules of what might be considered stuffy art or what might be considered defining art. In other words, it can't be defined. We're going to define it, and we're going to turn things topsy-turvy. We're going to turn things on their head in Dadaism. And so let's go back and look at surrealism as our last particular piece of art here, and you're going to get to look at some things more distinctly, but I wanted to at least fit them into a context. When I went to the Dali Museum, it was interesting, and this is also true of Kandinsky's work as I was looking at it and reading about it. When you go to Dali's museum, they have the first part of the museum organized chronologically to tell you about his life. And before he began painting his surreal works, Dali had a lot of very classical art training. If you were to go to Dali's museum, you could see his work in still lifes and representational art and landscapes and portraits. And it's pretty interesting to see that if you're looking for, anyone can do that, if you looked at Dali's work in the beginning part of the museum, you certainly probably wouldn't think that you would be capable of producing that kind of artwork. And if you get to go to the Dali Museum, or if you've already been, or if you get to go again, I would say definitely get a tour guide, because they did an excellent job of taking you through the Dali's personal history and what he was trying to accomplish and say with his various works. And Dali's museum works his surrealist pieces can be out of what appear to be dream sequences, or maybe nightmares. You can think about the Freudian aspects of his painting and how those things might have been affected by some of the modern thought that we talked about in the previous lecture this week. But the surrealism of Dali, I think the better educated you become, and the more information you have about the paintings he painted, you can have a greater appreciation, if not love, for his work. I personally wouldn't want a Dali painting hanging in my home, but that doesn't mean that I can't have an art appreciation for the work that he did and for what it represents. And it doesn't mean that we can't become better educated about what this modern art is trying to do and accomplish. And so I want you to do that as you look at the specific videos on Google Classroom this week. I'm also going to put up just a couple of audio clips, or if I can't find them, maybe video clips of the audio, if you will, from YouTube, of a couple of pieces of modern music. And I want you to look at that modern music and note it for its atonal qualities, for the confusion that was brought about even in the music world in this post-World War I era, where we're having a lot of conflict about ideas and about the ways that we should think or not think about the world that we live in. So I'm going to sign off on this art introduction and send you off into Google Classroom to look at these different artist movements and to look at some more specific pieces and artists. So I hope you enjoy it. Bye-bye.